How are you?
I'm well.
Well, you probably don't feel this way, but I feel like you've set an impossible bar, Will, in setting expectations here. But that's okay. Will left for me a little bit on the intro because of all the accolades, it was probably too many for just one person to list. But they're impressive and relevant to, I think, a lot of our conversation. You have a PhD from MIT. You were a Fulbright Fellow, a Rhodes Scholar, an entrepreneur. You shred electric guitar. You were one of, believe it or not, for everybody, 2 pole vaulting PhDs at our table last night for dinner. Where's Elizabeth? I mean, that's not going to happen again. At least not for me. Well, it may happen for you, mathematically speaking. You are a reluctantly retired skateboarder, and congrats on the book.
Thank you.
Recent author, and also a voice actor because you recorded the audiobook, which is really cool. It's awesome to be with you. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
You're a scientist and an artist, and your work, everybody can look at the subtitle of the book, is about centering the human in technology, which is probably nothing more important than we could be talking about right now. And in that vein, would you start with a poem?
I will start with a poem. And I was really inspired about the words around compassion this morning. I used to say that my motto was to show compassion through computation, but it gets tough trying to change the world, as I'm sure you all know. And so in the book, I talk about how I picked up skateboarding again when I thought I was going to drop out of MIT. And this poem is related to getting through some of the tough times that happen as we endeavor to start, do our organizations start different initiatives in the world. So it's called Terminal Resistance. Withstand the praise and the prison of expectations. Withdraw the temptation to mold yourself into who they thought you should be. Remember the doctor who told your worried mother, a PhD for this child is out of reach. Remember not because they were wrong, but because their eyes were too small to imagine the frail and fading body in their care contained a formidable spirit. Remember their miscalculation is one we can all make when we fail to look beyond present conditions and bleak predictions. Withstand the pressure and the prism of demands spread across innocuous requests and insistent pleas. Withdraw your participation when you must fold your dignity, lower your stature, or diminish your worth to appease would-be kingmakers. Remember the dear ones, the ones who took the calls and took the time to remind you of who you were without the crown and why they believe in you. Take the time to listen to the frail, fading hearts who have forgotten the strength of their spirits. Remember the small, significant moments of acknowledgement and support. I remember the custodians who opened doors early so I could study longer. I remember the staff who gave me extra portions to show their pride and to encourage me to take bold strides. I remember the coaches who told me the truth, lest they cheat me with cheap congratulations on less than my best. I remember the teachers who gave me more than required so I could know the elasticity of my capacities. Do not be afraid to reach higher than others dared, to stay longer when seemingly no one else cared, to fertilize the soil of toil before the vision germinates, before the sprout pushes through the terminal resistance that unleashes your power.
And we're done. Have a nice afternoon. Okay. A number of images in there that remind me of thinking about you as I was reading the book in your office at MIT. Can you take us back to the Aspire mirror and how you got on this journey?
Yes, so in front of you, you should have a copy of the book and you see this beautiful cover. I am holding a mask. And the reason I'm holding a mask is I was a student at the MIT Media Lab working on a class project. I took this class called Science Fabrication. You read science fiction. I heard there's some science fiction fans in the audience. And then you create something you probably otherwise wouldn't make as long as you could do it in 6 weeks. So I wanted a shapeshift. 6 weeks wasn't enough time to transform the laws of physics. So I thought, what could I do? So I decided to build something called an Aspire mirror, which would allow me to change not my physical body, but the appearance of my reflection in a mirror using this property half-silvered mirror. So when you shine light through it, it comes in like you would see on a computer screen. And if there's just the black background, it looks like a mirror. So you get the effect of having like a Snapchat filter, but instead of it being through your video feed, it's actually in your mirror, because this is what we do at the Media Lab. So I was just having fun. As I was working on the project, I thought it would be nice for the actual digital face to follow me in the mirror. So I decided to get a webcam that had some face tracking software. This is where it goes sideways. So I'm trying to get the webcam to detect my face, and it's not detecting my face that consistently. It happened to be Halloween, there was a party, and I had a white mask around. And so when it wasn't detecting my face consistently, that's when I started to put on the white mask. And the white mask, I didn't even put the white mask on all the way, right? I was a little annoyed. I barely put it on my face, and it was already detecting the inanimate white mask while my human face remained undetected. And so this was kind of a moment for me. Here I was at my dream school. I finally made it to MIT. I'm in this epicenter of innovation, supposedly, and I'm coding in a white mask. And so that led me down what eventually became the Algorithmic Justice League.
Can you, the one thing that really struck me as I was thinking about you and reading your book, your first impulse was, I don't want to draw social conclusions about this. This is hard. I don't want to do this. This is not what I got into technology for. Is that, how did you think about that?
Oh yeah, no, I got into computer science because people are messy, right? I was like, yay, math, algorithms, woohoo, good times. And so when I was at MIT, I was wanting, again, to explore imaginative ideas and that kind of thing. The last thing I really wanted to be doing was talking about social justice issues. I figured somebody else could take on that role, and I'll make cool technology. And so it was in that process of trying to make interesting technology and encountering these sorts of issues that I realized that I couldn't escape those issues. But I was reluctant at first, because when you speak up, you have a target on your back. And being a Black woman in tech was hard enough. Now, being the Black woman in tech, talking about racism and sexism in tech, I don't know if I want to be that one. So I was hesitant, for sure.
Yeah. But where did this go? So what did you find out, and how did you get conviction that this is what you're supposed to be doing?
That I should do it?
Yeah.
Trump got elected. And so I thought, well, maybe I should step up and do my part with things that were going on. And I say that because I had friends who voted for Trump. I had friends who voted for others. I grew up in Oxford, Mississippi, and Memphis, Tennessee. But I remember specifically being at the Media Lab after that election. And there was just the sense of dejection from some people in my network and a sense of elation from others, but also a bit of foreboding of, we can't just trust who's in power to safeguard the technologies that are being deployed. And so I felt like there was an impetus to actually stand up. Another thing that happened around that time, it was 2016, there was a paper that came out of Georgetown Law called the Perpetual Lineup. And in that paper, they showed 1 in 2 adults in the US had their face in a face recognition network that could be searched by law enforcement using algorithms that hadn't been audited for accuracy. And so I had a lot of excuses for why I was not the one. This was not what I should do. I'm gonna keep making fun Aspire mirrors and other sorts of projects. But once I saw that, okay, this tech is moving out of the lab and into the real world, and it could lead to false arrest and other things that I predicted at the time that did end up becoming the reality. And so the stakes were high, the political climate had changed, and I realized that maybe I was given these opportunities for a reason.
What did you find out?
So I decided to first start just testing faces with different companies to see how an AI system might read a face. So you could detect the face, you could guess the age of a face, you could guess the perceived gender, and so forth. And as I was doing this, I was using my TED profile image. And my TED profile image, sometimes it wouldn't be detected, or sometimes I was misgendered. So because of the misgendering, I started then testing photos of WNBA players and Olympic athletes and all of these sorts of things, and I saw more misgendering. So that's what gave me the idea to create the Gender Shades project, which was essentially seeing how well different tech companies performed at the task of guessing the perceived gender of an image. Long story short, tested IBM, Microsoft, later on Amazon, and they all, unsurprisingly, showed gender bias, they showed skin type bias, and they showed a bias at the intersection as well. So you could have a system like, for example, Microsoft, perfection was possible. The lighter skinned males, pale males as I call them affectionately, there were no errors, right? The darker skinned females, on the other hand, in some categories, the error rates were around 47% for commercially sold products. So I thought the tech companies might want to know. So I ended up sharing the results with them. And then the paper came out. It became one of the most cited papers in the kind of field I'm in on algorithmic auditing and so forth. And eventually some changes happened.
When you called different companies, they responded very differently.
Oh my goodness, yes. There was also no response. So in addition to the companies I mentioned, there was also Face++, based in China. And so they did not respond to us directly, but in the study, they had actually performed best on darker skinned men. So in the news media, they were saying that they had better performance, but that was all we heard. IBM, speaking of the power of networks, I had been at an Aspen AI roundtable, and the head of AI research was there. So the day I was turning in my master's work for MIT, which showed this research, I actually met him as I was walking to MIT with his 2 young daughters. Who were interested in tech and so forth. So I said, you're gonna wanna read this paper. So when I emailed IBM, they actually were very responsive, invited me to the headquarters, actually released a new model that I tested before the paper came out. Microsoft was a little late to the game. They waited until the paper came out, and then they realized a postdoc had been a co-author of that paper and started paying attention. So a few different approaches and responses.
Interesting. You're very insistent on precision, not surprisingly. It's very important for what you're doing. You started to talk about the harms that come from being excoded, as I've learned to put it. And the Algorithmic Justice League has people should go look at it, a taxonomy of harms. Why is that important to be very precise about what can happen?
I think it's most important when we're talking about precision to not think about the precision of the technology, but the precision of the lived experience of people who are being harmed. So when we talk about the X-coded, no one's immune from being X-coded. You could be Taylor Swift and you have the deepfakes, exploitative photos, or Tom Hanks having his likeness used to promote some dental service he never used, or the young girls in Spain who are having deepfakes made of them by their classmates, or people like Robert Williams falsely arrested due to facial recognition technologies, Detroit Police Department, Portia Woodruff, 8 months pregnant, same kind of story. And so
accused against common sense of carjacking.
I don't know anyone carjacking 8 months pregnant, but yeah.
It's like this faith in technology just overrides what you're seeing in front of you. It makes no sense. But anyway, sorry.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
For sure. What was the question?
I don't remember. But precision on detailing harms, the taxonomy of harms, and why that's important.
I think it's important for the taxonomy of harms, but I also had to grapple with focusing on precision and accuracy, particularly as somebody with a computer science background. And so when I first started the work, so much of it was focused on the accuracy numbers or the performance metrics, right? The false positive rates and that kind of thing. And with that focus, people weren't actually focused on the harm. So let's say we had perfect facial recognition, which we don't. That could lead to a surveillance state that you don't want, right? Or you can imagine drones with guns and facial recognition. It's not just a question of how accurate systems are, but how can these systems be abused, and what are the safeguards we can put in place?
I want to talk about delivery mechanisms, because you've evolved since the Gender Shades paper and presentation, and really kind of came into your own as someone who wanted to make sure these ideas, your research, everything that you were finding were accessible. And I love the story of you going to Brussels, meeting with EU defense ministers, and to talk about how that meeting started.
So there are gatekeepers. So I remember being so excited because I had been invited to be a member of the EU Global Tech Panel. And one of my mentors, who I respect so much, Megan Smith, she was a former CTO of the United States. Some of you might be familiar with her, many different firsts, but she was the first engineer in the role. And she pulled up a seat for me at that table. So I was excited. Here I am talking with the big dogs. Let's go. Let's go to Brussels. So I get to Brussels and I'm trying to just check in so I can go to the meeting. And I tell them I'm here for the meeting. And they're just looking at me as if I don't belong. And granted, I didn't look like the gray suits walking around. So they had a point. So I explained who I was there for. And they said, well, who brought you here? And so I shared with them that I had an invitation letter and I pulled it out. They said anyone could print anything from the internet. They're not wrong, right? So now I'm pulling out my phone, hoping the international plan doesn't fail me now. And I was able to get in touch with the secretary there, and they brought me in, and I was given this special badge. When I got to the room, I realized that nobody else had that special badge. And this was this is the work before the work, when you're trying to do the work, right, to get in.
Right. And then you go to if I'm not mistaken, you go to the meeting and they play AI Ain't I a Woman, which you made. I think I'm getting that right.
Yes. So
and what is that? And tell us. I mean, this whole thing of making sure that the delivery mechanism works and is accessible, it really had a profound impact on the mood of the room.
It's true. So we were just talking about some of the research that I conducted, and that was shared as a typical research paper. Now, not everybody's trying to read a research paper, right? And so I thought of how do we move from AI audits or algorithmic audits, like what the Gender Shades paper was, to something that a wider audience can connect with. And so that became this notion of the evocative audit, and that brings in poetry. So I created this poem called AI Ain't I a Woman, which is a spoken word poem, but it's also a test of AI systems. So I show the faces of Oprah Winfrey. I show Sojourner Truth. I show Michelle Obama. I show all of these iconic women being misgendered or otherwise mislabeled by AI systems from Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and so forth, right? So I ask, can machines ever see my queens as I view them? Can machines ever see our grandmothers as we knew them? Ida B. Wells, data science pioneer, hanging facts, stacking stats on the lynching of humanity, teaching truths hidden in data, each entry and omission, a person worthy of respect. Shirley Chisholm, unbought and unbossed, the first Black Congresswoman, but not the first to be misunderstood by machines well-versed in data-driven mistakes. Michelle Obama, unabashed and unafraid to make her crown of history. Yet her crown seems a mystery to systems unsure of her hair. A wig, a bouffant, a toupee, maybe not. Are there no words for our braids and our locks? The sunny skin and relaxed hair make Oprah the first lady. Even for her face well known, some algorithms fault her, echoing sentiments that strong women are men. We laugh, celebrating the successes of our sisters with Serena smiles. No label is worthy of our beauty. And so even though I was the only Black person in that room physically, I brought them in with me, right? And this was to the EU Global Tech Panel. And so it was led by the vice president of the European Commission. You had the head of World Economic Forum, president of Microsoft, all kinds of people who were there. And so that did set a different sort of stage. And later on, when you had EU defense ministers thinking about adopting facial recognition for lethal autonomous weapons, this was played ahead of that conversation, because in that particular AI anti-woman video, you see the top tech companies in the world you see Amazon labeling Oprah's face as a male. No shade to AWS as a sponsor of this event. This is an Amazon editor's pick and so forth, so there's always a learning journey. But all this to say, it was showing that you had to take more of a pause than maybe what companies might market initially when they, of course, want you to adopt a particular system.
That was a journey for you, and I'm conscious that to Jeff Weiner's point that we should know our audience, there's a lot of founders in here, some younger than others, who are on their journeys, building their companies, running around, psyching themselves up every day to do what they got to do. Your journey of like mixing the hard science, the math, the data, having all the answers with art was a journey for you. It wasn't like at the beginning that wasn't necessarily how you were going to handle that meeting, but you gained the confidence to do that. How did that happen?
Yes, so I am the daughter of an artist and a scientist. So the art didn't come from out of nowhere.
Yeah.
But being an underrepresented person in the STEM field, I didn't want my technical expertise or credibility to be seen as less than, or for my art to come off as being gimmicky.
Right.
So at first I felt I had to armor up, right? So I got all the degrees you can imagine, all the fellowships, all of these other things. And it wasn't really until I was working on my 4th degree, PhD from MIT, that I felt like, okay, the artists can peek out now. And so AI Anti-Woman, which you heard a snippet of it just now, that was my first affirmative step of saying, okay, if I say I'm a poet of code, and part of a poet's job is to help the world see themselves differently, and in this case, see technology differently, then I have to step up. So that was me stepping up to the call of being a poet of code.
I think we're grateful for that. I want to take a step back just to talk about, these are AI and harnessing it to the incredible speed of dissemination, the computing power that's now available. It's everywhere. It's what everybody's talking about. That said, these aren't new issues. Like technology making choices about excluding some images, some people, some realities is not new. And maybe you could tell people what the Shirley card was.
Yes. So sometimes old burns, new urns, collecting data, chronicling our past, often forgetting to deal with gender, race, and class. So if we go back to the history of photography, before we get to computer vision and facial recognition, we're just trying to figure out if we can make photos in the analog world, right? So you have film, you have chemical solution, you're trying to get an image to be printed. So back in the day, they used to have something called the Shirley card. There are a series of them, but at some point there was one woman who came to be known as Shirley, and she was literally the standard by which the film was calibrated to see if the chemical solution was actually portraying people as they ought to be portrayed. So these initial ones essentially set the default to be a white default. And I see young faces, but I see older faces. You've seen the old photos, right? All you can see are eyes and teeth and that sort of thing, right? That is part of the legacy of it. But also, it didn't have to be that way. Different film technologies evolved. So for example, Kodak changed when you had furniture companies and chocolate companies complaining, right? You can't see the difference between the milk chocolate and the dark chocolate. You can't see the difference with the different woods. And so people with dark skin actually benefited when they came out with new products that were meant to better expose chocolate and furniture. But also, hey, you can see me in the photo now at the birthday.
When you want to do it, you can do it. Finish the analogy. So what's the analogy now? What is the Shirley card in AI?
So in this case, I think it's really, I alluded to it a bit earlier, is this white default, right? So sometimes I'll call it the pale male default, but white as being normative. And so when we look at many of the data sets that are used as the standard by which to either train models or to test how well the models are doing, we oftentimes have a false sense of progress because of the measures we've chosen. That was a big part of my research. I created a new data set to serve as a benchmark because the government benchmarks, women of color were represented less than 4.4% of the time. So you could still get a pretty high score, right? And completely dismiss a whole important section of humanity. But also what happened was when people improved those benchmarks and improved the training data, you did see an improvements in the performance from a technical perspective.
People do really, maybe more at the beginning of when you were doing this early research and releasing this early research, and maybe this is a sign of progress, but I think you were getting the response like, are you sure? Because math is just math, and computers are neutral, and this is just reflecting reality. How did you answer that?
Well, that's why I would show the example of Kodak, right? Because you could also make the argument that a camera is meant to be objective, right? Here's a lens. The lens isn't biased or racist or that kind of thing, but there's a process it's going through. And so there are choices being made about what's going to be in that chemical solution. There are choices being made about what's going to be the standard. And the biggest thing is there are choices being made about what the default is. And defaults aren't neutral. They have our human fingerprints all over them.
So what are we doing? What is the Algorithmic Justice League doing? What are some of the things that you're working on to kind of stem this tide? I could get quite discouraged thinking about, geez, I mean, the numbers that are being, $400 billion of research has been, I think Goldman Sachs estimated that this year just from 5 of the big companies. That's how much money they're putting into, the next step. Like, how can our merry band of, thoughtful people, but without those kinds of resources, how do we turn the tide on that? How do we make sure that data sets are representative, that people understand the harms, that we slow things? I don't think you're ever saying, I want to stop this. We're not stopping it, but how do we make sure that it's not regressive?
Yes, how do we build AI for all of us and not just the privileged few, which is really why the Algorithmic Justice League exists. One thing we believe is that everybody's story and everybody's experience is important. So this is my story, right, of coding in a white mask, and we see that evolution of that single experience, right, then leading to the creation of the Algorithmic Justice League, leading to testifying in front of Congress, leading to legislation being passed in multiple cities around the US that restrict harmful uses of facial recognition. The companies that we audited, all of the US-based companies, actually stopped selling facial recognition to law enforcement. Later on, after some litigation, Facebook deleted over 1 billion face prints. And so I share all of this to say that it matters when we speak up. We can build better systems. We can also stop harmful systems and harmful deployments. One thing that we've been doing lately are different sorts of campaigns. So anybody been to the airport lately? Show of hands. All right, anyone seen the facial recognition scans? Okay, how many of you know that it's optional? Not that many people. So this is supposed to be an opt-in program. You guys know about design patterns, right? This is not an opt-in design kind of pattern. And so we saw this happening actually just last week. I was talking to Secretary Mayorkas, head of Department of Homeland Security, because we had a summit called the Freedom Flyer Summit, and we started something called the Opt-Out Club. So this is the kind of thing we do with AJL. And what we have been doing is collecting hundreds of stories of people's experiences with TSA. So I was able to read out to Secretary Mayorkas and also the representatives of TSA, people talking about how it wasn't truly an opt-in sort of an experience. And we were able to bring those stories to bear and get a verbal commitment. We're going to follow it up because we always have to, right? That they would change the story. But I think it goes to show the importance of actually resisting, speaking up, and then having access at tables of power. So that's the sort of thing we do. So we like to say we're naming and changing. It's not about naming and shaming and just saying you did it wrong, that's it, we get our social justice points or something like that. It's really, how do we transform a system, right? So that we get to enjoy and experience the promises of what AI can be.
I imagine you get the question, and I happen to know you get the question all the time, but the killer robots, is that kind of, and you have a point of view on why that's not a helpful question.
Well, it's interesting because I do support, and I talk about it in the book, that I support the campaign to stop killer robots. So that example where I shared, you have the drones with the guns, with the facial recognition, that technology is there. You have all kinds of things being used in Ukraine and in Gaza and so forth. So I think those concerns are extremely valid. That was even why I was serving on the EU Global Tech panel. So I did some initial research on the limitations of computer vision within a military context and what those restrictions need to be. So there are definitely dangers with these sorts of systems. But when it comes to X risk, or the computers are going to get so smart, and that kind of thing, I very much think about not just how computers hypothetically can rise up against us, but how AI can kill us slowly. And so when you're thinking about access to opportunity, so the AI system that denies you or your loved one the kidney transplant because there was a race-based correction put in it, right? True story. The self-driving car that doesn't see you as a pedestrian because they show research that it doesn't work as well on short people compared to tall people. So the vertically challenged like me and children are more at risk, right? So that was the point I was making in the book, was that we don't have to think about some hypothetical future, to mobilize to make better AI systems. We can think about immediate harms, people who are being excoded now, and make decisions now for people who exist in the next generation, so that your hue isn't a cue to dismiss your humanity, and that data doesn't destine you to discrimination.
And absent your work, those are things we would never know are being written into the code or excluded or included in the data sets. We would just never know.
I like to take all the credit, but there was a huge, so many people who were looking at this that I truly admire, many of them being Black women scholars. So I think about people like Dr. Sophia Noble. She's a MacArthur Genius Award winner. She has the book, Algorithms of Oppression, where she was talking about bias in search engine results. She was trying to find an activity for her daughter to do with her playmates, and she searched for Black girl. And what came up were these pornographic images. Same thing when you search for Asian girls as well. Not so much if you search for girl or just white girl. And generally, that's what that would map to. I think about Dr. LaTanya Sweeney. She was the first Black woman to get her PhD from MIT in computer science. She was on my committee. She did a test of seeing what would happen when you search for quote unquote Black sounding names versus white sounding names. And turned out when you put in a quote unquote Black sounding name, you would get ads that implied a criminal record, even if that person didn't have a criminal record. And so you then had these representational harms, because now you might not get the job or get the housing because you look sus when I search in the box. And so there are so many people who laid down a groundwork. I think about Dr. Ruha Benjamin and her work, Race After Technology, and also Viral Justice. I just finished my PhD not too long ago, so I could keep going on with the bibliography and so forth. And you can
I think that was all alphabetical.
in the back of the book, but I think it's definitely, I also have to shout out Dr. Timnit Gebru. who co-authored the Gender Shades paper with me. When I started my work at MIT as a master's student, she was finishing up her PhD at Stanford in the leading computer vision lab in the world. And so her mentorship definitely helped me out. And then she goes on later to become the Google ethics co-lead. And then some drama happened. Some of you might have seen. She actually has a book that'll be coming out soon. So, but yes, I did help, with the white mask and so forth, for sure.
I appreciate your precision. Absent in part your work. Fair enough. One of the themes that in a lot of conversations we've been having, at least I've been having with others here in our breakout, at lunch, at dinner last night, talking about learning and learning curves and ending up in seats where you were trained to do something else, but all of a sudden you're a leader, and how you deal with that. And you talk about that a little bit in the book as this is kind of the age of the last masters or last experts, that AI could produce an apprenticeship gap. And I'm very interested in that and how you think we should counter that, or if that's an okay thing, or what. Explain that if you don't mind.
Yes, I remember I was speaking, I think I was on a panel with the CEO of Cohere. And he was all excited about the ways in which AI can basically save us time, right? So that we wouldn't have to be doing the mundane essentials. And that's when I started thinking of this notion of the apprentice gap and also professional calluses, which then leads to the last master. So let me explain. So I used to play a little bit of guitar, and I dropped it down so that I could go, down this educational path. And then out of nowhere, I was featured in Rolling Stone alongside some of those women that I mentioned with you. And so I felt inspired to go get a guitar. It was a Les Paul / Gibson Appetite Burst, for those you know. And so I got this guitar I always wanted to play. And as I started, I realized, I kind of still have my calluses here, right? And those calluses came from prior practice years. And so I was thinking about this in the notion of professions. What are the professional calluses that we build up that we might not even be aware of until it actually comes up in context of doing your job? So now how does this relate to AI? If we're automating away all of the entry-level positions, right, how do you build up that experience you need, and hence the apprentice gap? And so if you never have the on-ramps to gain the skills, then we end up living in this age of the last masters.
So what do we do? I'm a lawyer by training. That's highly boring to most people, but the repetition of reading and drafting and all those things, then 6 years in or 10 years in, you can kind of automatically cite chapter and verse on contracts or whatever it is that you're doing, and then all of a sudden you have judgment because you know sort of where things fit and how things go. I can't imagine developing that judgment without the repetition of an apprentice. How do we fix that?
I think you have to safeguard that apprentice time period. And so even if you're adopting automated tools, you don't want to have that kind of atrophy occurring. It's like if you never worked out, that kind of thing. So I think you're going to have to be intentional about creating space and being disciplined about not just using the automated path because it exists.
Got it. It's like this technological determinism. It's there. We have to use it. We have to make it bigger, better. It's an interesting. It's a very compelling force that are we fighting against it, or we're trying to channel it, or I don't know.
When it comes to technological determinism, this idea that technology will progress, and so you might as well just go with the flow. My existence, the existence of the Algorithmic Justice League, that we've had companies change their practices, that laws have been enacted, and all of that shows ultimately that we have agency. The future of AI is up to us, what we decide to create, how we decide to create it, the norms we establish. And so that's what gets me excited, because it is not determined the fate of AI.
Let's talk about that, because what's we're in a room where people are investing a lot of capital. They're contracting with services that embed AI. What's our responsibility? What are we supposed to be doing? What is this room supposed to be doing as we're building our businesses?
One thing that I think is really important to think through is kind of this thing I think of as algorithmic hygiene, right? And so a big part of it is data provenance, knowing where the data came from. without that, you're liable to all kinds of lawsuits, which we've been seeing from some of the leaders as well. I also think about meaningful transparency. And I think a lot about affirmative consent. So much of what people have become excited about with generative AI has been built on a foundation of stolen data. And I don't think I think companies that are more careful about where that data is coming from so they can avoid some of the legal pitfalls will, in the end, last longer.
I have so many questions. Okay, we were talking about your accolades and all the things that you're doing up front, which are incredible. It's a lot, and one of the things that we've been talking about, and the groups I think have been talking about are how do you organize your time? How do you prioritize? No one person or one group can do everything. And you had a moment like this as you were about to get the PhD, and you were like, this is too much. And so what did you learn from that? Or what have you learned since then? Like, what some guidance for us who aspire to do a third of what you're doing in terms of like volume and impact or whatever, but like, and a third's probably very high, but some lessons for the group.
Yeah, no, I got a case of what I call the academic twisties. And so some of you all might have remembered from the last Olympics when Simone Biles had the twisties. And so she flips and she turns, and the twisties occur for gymnasts when they're no longer able to track themselves in the air. And it can be very dangerous because you could land on your neck. It could potentially end your life. And so she had that decision of pulling out with the weight of gold literally on her shoulders. And as that was happening, she was having the gymnastics twisties. I was having the academic twisties. This was my 4th degree. I'm testifying, I'm doing art shows, I'm doing way too much. And at some point, I was just so burned out that a week before I was supposed to defend my PhD, I just had to reach out to my committee and tell them that I couldn't. In fact, I was like, and I'm gonna quit. Then one of my committee members said, instead of quitting, why don't you just take a pause and then come back and think about it? So I did take a pause. And during that pause, I reconnected with skateboarding. So I was watching the Olympics, and the Ghana skate commercial came out. I think it was Meta, Facebook, that did this commercial, but they were showing skaters in Ghana and all of that. So being from Ghana, being a former skateboarder, I thought, okay, if I drop out of MIT, maybe I could become an Olympic skateboarder as an alternative.
We can get you to Paris, I think, in a day.
So my friends let me live that dream for a little bit. And then at that time, you start seeing the Taliban resurgence back in Afghanistan, and women started burning their diplomas or hiding it and so forth. And it really just made me pause and think about how much I was taking for granted the opportunity to be in this body, to be in this skin, to be in this perceived gender, and to have those opportunities. Not so long ago, people who looked like me would have been workers or would have been slaves, or it would have been even illegal for me to read and write and have the knowledge that would allow me to earn this PhD from MIT, right? And so that was kind of the impetus that I needed to get back. But it was an important lesson for me that you don't have to do it all at once all the time. You can take a pause, you can take a beat, and it's okay. Things will work out.
We're gonna do Q&A for a couple minutes, get your guys' questions. We're gonna deploy what is now known as the Mendy method, which is, I guess, you have to earn the follow-up question, which was kind of, he can do that, I can't do that. He runs this firm. Okay, so anybody have a question?
Question.
Mike's out.
Right here.
Hi, Chuma. I'm the founder of Nexo. Thank you for talking. Huge inspiration. I followed your journey.
Thank you.
When I hear you talk about the apprenticeship gap, I find that fascinating. I'm curious how you balance that with the flip side of the coin, which is as technology evolves, humans evolve, right? And things that we consider sort of requiring experts today, many years from now, will not. Those are sort of the tasks that like entry-level people will be doing, right? It's sort of like, even as I look back as a software engineer, what I was learning in college, people are learning in high school now, right? And so I'm curious how you think about that. Like, is there truly an apprenticeship gap, or does what is considered mastery today just move down and then we continue to evolve and what we become masters are things we don't even imagine right now?
I think that's a great question because we have to look at different timelines. When I think of the apprentice gap, I'm thinking about it as it exists today with the adoption of AI systems. I think you make a great point, right? What is considered mastery will continue to evolve. I think about a nonprofit named NEDA, National Eating Disorder Association. So they got all on the AI hype, right? We can automate everything. And their workers wanted to unionize. So I think there was a Vice headline. It was, I think, May 25th, something like workers are unionizing. And so they're going to replace them with a chatbot. They replace them with the chatbot. It's not even a week before the next headline. Chatbot shut down. Why was the chatbot shut down? Well, it turned out it was actually giving information that's known to make eating disorders worse. And so I think the stage we're in with the development, we're still so early with the development of AI systems. And I think sometimes there's a premature adoption before we have the safeguards in place, before we fully understand the jobs and the roles. And so with the apprentice gap, it's really saying, are we thinking through what it means if we automate away some of the entry-level positions? Not to say we can't reimagine it, but if we haven't reimagined it at this point and we're adopting it, we're going to be in trouble. That's a great question.
Yeah. Sounds like we were in another one. Hand over there.
Hi. You said something that was kind of fascinating to me when you were talking about data provenance. And I'm just curious, it seems like right now we have Zuck championing this idea of an open source model, but it's not open source in how it's being trained and the data going into it. So like, how do you reason with something like that? And how should I feel about that as a consumer?
Yes, open source AI models are really fascinating to me for that very reason, right? Because if you're open sourcing something that's been trained, but we don't know what it's been trained on, and even if you say, oh, we have the weights to the model and all of that, and that is further than others have gone, we're not actually seeing the entire pipeline. And so I agree with you that it's an incomplete way of open sourcing, but I also, especially because so much of my work has been focused on biometric technologies, faces in particular, certain kind of data can be harder to anonymize just because the data itself, at least in its raw form, is actually a representation of a person. So I think you have to be really cautious about what you're open sourcing and why and what the risks are. So for example, just having an open source data set of faces is extremely risky. People have been and can be targeted, we know, with the rise of deepfakes and so forth. So I certainly think you have to proceed with caution and ask how open for who, under what terms. And also data expiration. Is there ever time to delete a certain data set, and what would the conditions for that be? Data minimization. How much data do we actually need to accomplish this versus just getting as much data as possible just in case we might need it later on? I also think a lot about context collapse. Data collected for one purpose being used in a context it was never intended for. In the book, I talk about this reference of kangaroo are not caribou, thinking about self-driving cars. So let's say you train it on Canadian streets. Okay, cool, caribou, avoid the caribou. Now you take that model to Australia, and suddenly the animals hop, not in the plane of reference. What are we going to do? That kind of thing. Another one I talk about in the book was this Canadian company, and they were well-intentioned health tech startup. They wanted to see if they could use voice analysis for early detection of dementia. And so they worked with Canadians who spoke English first language. And when they tested it on Canadians who were first language French speakers, it was detecting the French speakers as having dementia, which we know that's not the right signal, but an example of context collapse. So that's where that data provenance really comes in. But it's not just knowing where the data is coming from, but also thinking of questions of ownership and control.
You helped, we'll get you in a second, but you helped you advise the administration on President Biden's executive order on AI. And you were referring to a little earlier, like states and cities who have passed laws, ordinances. There's, I don't know, 16 bills in the California state legislature right now, including SB 1047, getting a lot of criticism. There's the EU. Is there a good model? Is there a good composite of models? Like what do you look at and think, oh, that works, or are we so early we've got to stitch all this together?
I mean, right now we're seeing different kinds of approaches. So in the EU, for example, with the EU AI Act, you have more of a risk-based approach, right? So saying if the AI is high risk, then we're going to have certain kinds of regulations come in. If it's lower risk, you're fine. And then in the US, we saw with particularly the Office of Science, Technology, and Policy, they released an AI Bill of Rights, which was a rights-based framework, which is saying, what is first our vision? And coming back to some of the conversation we were having earlier, the vision and the values. And I think you want to start with the vision and the values, right? So AI systems should be safe and effective. We should be protected from algorithmic discrimination. There should be human alternatives and fallback. There should be a notice and explanation. And so you certainly see multiple approaches coming on board. I think the hard part, and it continues to be difficult, is when a technology is ever evolving, not restricting it so much that we can't get to the benefits, but also not being so free and open that immediate and obvious harms are being let go.
And that we're relying on companies to self-regulate who prove that they're not going to do that. Question?
Hi, thanks so much for your time and everything you've shared. One quick question is, we as young startups with limited resources, even if our heart is in the right place, we're trying to care for a lot of coming from Latino backgrounds or different backgrounds. The amount of money do you have in order to be able to even gather the data for new areas that you're trying to do it for training, or even go source data from the populations that you're doing? What advice do you have for startups like us where the incentives are not necessarily aligned? I'm trying to get the customers may not or may care about some of these things, even the portfolio of population that you can actually do. What do you think startups can tap on today that would help them in general to get the resources, to get the data resources or do the collections? Grant is away, but it takes a long time and effort.
Yes, values cost us something at some time. And I think in the short run, it is going to take more time. It is going to take more resources. But in the long term, if you have the more robust AI systems that are built on your values, you do have people who want to say, what are the responsible AI options? What are the ethical AI pipelines? That's probably one of the number one questions I get asked the most. We see all of these companies doing it in this rushed, hurried way because of FOMO. Are there alternatives where it's been built right? And I think it's worth taking the time to build that foundation that's not based on stolen data. I think the lawsuits that are going to continue to mount and the cost of those are going to, we're going to start seeing the impact on the bottom line sooner rather than later. So I think you have to have a longer term vision for the type of company you want to be, the sorts of values you want to affirm. And if that means you don't move as fast as the other companies that will later on likely be slowed down, right? That is a calculation you have to make that's based on the values you have. But also people want systems that work, right? So if you have for example, I invested in one company, Bloomer Tech, and they were addressing a major issue when it comes to healthcare, which is heart disease for women. is the number one killer of women. 1 in 3 women who die of cardiovascular disease, but less than a quarter of research participants are women. And a lot of the information we have, and even the AI models that have been trained on male data. And as a result, the models that are being used right now fail half of humanity. There's a huge business opportunity, right? And so by them taking the time to actually address this data gap, they're actually able to better serve humanity in the long run. And I think that's worth the time.
I just got the high sign. Dr. Joy, thanks for sharing your story in the book. It's a rare computer science page turner. I really mean that, and you guys should read it. We're gonna, yeah, okay, yeah. Would you read? Yes. Would you do another poem?
Sure.
Would you declaim again?
Well, as we are ending the end of our time, I would like to end on a final poem, if you will all permit me. Do I have your permission?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, thank you. This one is called, I'm in between two, you can vote, Unstable Desire or The Brooklyn Tenant. So who wants to hear Unstable Desire? And who wants to hear The Brooklyn Tenants? Oh, okay. We're going Brooklyn.
I'm shocked by that vote. I gotta be honest with you. Just given title bias.
To the Brooklyn tenants, resisting and revealing the lie that we must accept the surrender of our faces, the harvesting of our data, the plunder of our traces. We celebrate your courage. No silence, no consent. You show the path to algorithmic justice requires a league, a sisterhood, a neighborhood, a summit, hallway gatherings, Sharpies and posters, research and potlucks, dancing and music, everyone playing a role to orchestrate change. To the Brooklyn tenants and freedom fighters around the world, persisting and prevailing against algorithms of oppression, automating inequality through weapons of math destruction. We stand with you in gratitude. You show the people have a voice and a choice. When defiant melodies harmonize to elevate human life, dignity, and rights, the victory is ours. Thank you.
Thanks.